Hi, so we're going to do the video on women in ancient Greece, particularly the prescribed sources. So if you can get your booklet out whilst we do this, that would be helpful. I should probably go back to something else temporarily to point out the things that we're going to look at in this video, and this is what the booklet looks like that you've got. We're just going to go through the women's part today. Remember, we're going to be doing women in ancient Greece in the Olympic Games, and this video is going to focus on the women in the ancient Greece part, and within that there are 4 bits, all of which have around 3 or 4, maybe a few more sources in each section. So each section we're looking at is the status of women in Athens. It's the status of women both within the Orcus and outside, marriage in Athens, the marriage ceremony, when and who to marry, expectations of role of a wife, women household duties, motherhood, weaving, supervision of slaves, and women in Sparta, education of girls, marriage and status of women. Now you'll notice that these are things that we've looked at in the book, the Renshaw book, and there are stuff that the questions that you looked at are related to. So these things, the exam paper that you'll have related to this is about basically how we know what we know, and that is by looking at the sources. Okay, so this booklet gives you some very specific sources. It gives you some sources that you will have to know for your exams. So in your exam paper, the questions, there'll be questions where you might be expected to remember some of these sources to be able to answer a question, or it might be that it's with specific reference to this source. But also these sources are about learning the skills to be able to handle sources you haven't seen before. So we'll look at this when we go through some past exam papers. We're not going to do the questions per se, but how you go through them. In your exam, you'll see questions that specifically refer to certain sources in these. You'll see questions that are just factual recall, which is what the reading we've done before previous videos you've watched. You'll see, I forgot what I said now. Factual recall, questions specific to sources in this booklet, questions that are on sources that you won't have seen before, that are in the insert, so it'll give you some sources to look at in the exam, some of which will be in this booklet. And then there are questions where it asks you to use your own knowledge, and maybe some from the insert, to answer more general questions, which you'll be asked to come up with an argument basically related to the question. So if we go back to where we were, we'll just go through it in order. I will point out that I'm going to send you this document, which is basically all the things, in fact more knowledge than you need to know with relation to these sources. You'll see I've highlighted parts of the passage, and I've given you notes. The notes is more than you need to know, and largely what I'll do is basically just read out what I've put here, but hopefully I'll be able to put some more emphasis on more important things. And the important thing you really need to know is, especially with these longer mark questions, which we'll look at towards the end of the video, so your 8 markers, your 12 markers, and to an extent your 6 markers, you've got your AO1, which is basically factual recall, and that isn't really related to these sources. That's basically the stuff we've done previously, and you need to be able to recall that information. You've got your AO2, which I put here, which is detailed knowledge with good interpretation of the ancient sources and a good understanding of their limitations. So the notes I've made here are largely related to this assessment objective. Okay, you need to understand them, and you need to understand why they can't tell you everything. Okay, then you might be thinking immediately the sort of very basic things you might think about, like bias, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, so the first source, the first topic, the status of women in Athens, is from Aristotle, Politics. Now, things to think about with Aristotle: he was a philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC, so 384 to 322 here, and he wrote about loads of things. He was a philosopher who didn't particularly specialise, but talks about lots of things. He's from Macedonia, which is kind of significant in the fact that this 4th century, especially towards the end of it, or from the mid onwards, but perhaps this whole period, is when Macedonia as a kingdom basically grew, and Macedonia is the place from which Alexander the Great was, who expanded the empire massively and then died and it splintered. That's not particularly important. But by this point, you're not thinking, if you're thinking about Athens, which is a lot of what the course talks about, it's not like the 5th century where Athens really was kind of the head, in inverted commas, of the Greek world. It weren't actually the head, but they were like the most. Think of them like the United States, for example. They're not the head of the world, but they might like to think of themselves that way, and they have significant power. So here, it's at a time where that's not really the case of Athens, it's more the case of Macedonia. But Aristotle, although he's from Macedonia, goes to Athens and joins Plato's academy, where he's a pupil for a long time. This is basically because despite Athens losing its power over Greece, it was still an educational centre. It has still all these places set up in the same way that if you think about places like Oxford and Cambridge been around a long time, and people still think, oh, they're amazing places to go and study. As I mentioned, Alexander the Great, he ended up tutoring him, and when he went on an expedition from the mid-330s onwards, so when he was expanding this Macedonian empire, that was when Aristotle went back to Athens, or rather just outside of it, and he formed his own school. All this information, you're not going to be asked on it, okay? This is just my brain's gone dead, sorry. Contextualising, there's the word, and it can also help you with your interpretation and understanding of limitations. So yeah, the politics describe the role that politics and political community must play in bringing about a virtual slice in citizenry. The politics also provides analysis of the kinds of political community that existed in his time, and shows where and how these cities fall short of the ideal community of virtuous citizens. Although in some ways we have clearly moved beyond his thought, i.e., as in this is talking about us today, the belief in inferiority of women, which we'll look at in a second, and his approval of slavery, there remains much of Aristotle's philosophy that is valuable today. Okay, so this is like the general stuff we're going to talk about. In your exam, you might be asked to pick out specific things, so that's what we're going to do now. But there is a point to say that in the politics, it might be an old text. It's nearly 2,500 years old, and obviously time's moved on in that point. You're going to see how he's got a belief in inferiority of women here and slavery, and obviously that's old-fashioned today, but there's still things that you might think are relevant. Okay, so let's look at the source. Although there may be exceptions to the order of nature, the male is by nature fitter for command than the female, just as the older and full-grown is superior to the younger and more immature. Notice it's highlighted. But in most constitutional states, the citizens ruled and are ruled by turns, for the idea of a constitutional state implies that the natures of the citizens are equal and do not differ at all. The relation of the male to the female is of this kind, but there the inequality is permanent. The free man rules over the slave, and another manner from that in which the male rules over the female, or the man over the child. So it's saying that here, we talked about slavery and women before, so it's a different sort of domination that man has over a woman to free over a slave. So you can see that that's basically setting up a thing where the order of importance or the hierarchy is slave, women, man, not man, slave, woman, for example. Although the parts of the soul are present in all of them, they are present in different degrees, for the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. The woman has, but it is without authority. So again, we're talking about the status of women here and how basically they're lacking status, and the child has, but is immature. All classes must be deemed to have their special attributes. As the poet says of women, silence is a woman's glory, but this is not equally the glory of a man. So again, we're seeing the difference in status, and we saw this in the book before, how basically women's voices were silenced, okay? And I've put what that is referencing here. It's Sophocles' Ajax 293, so this was a play. I can't remember if this is one of the sources off the top of my head, I don't think it is, where he says, woman, silence graces woman, okay? And that quote is about 100 years old at the time of this. Another point to point out, which I think we do have, is Pericles' funeral speech, although the record we have of that is in Thucydides, who basically, so Thucydides putting a speech into the mouth of Pericles, basically says the same thing, where the woman's glory is to be quiet. So here we can see about the status of women in these highlighted bits, basically that according to Aristotle here, that the men are just more capable, that men rule over women, but not in the same way as men rule over slaves. So that creates a hierarchy of men, women, slave. The woman can be intelligent, it seems, but doesn't have that authority. And that the goal of a woman is effectively to be silent. And I think if you saw the Pericles' funeral speech, it's like a woman's greatest glory is not to be spoken about. So she shouldn't be speaking, and she shouldn't be spoken about. She should do her household duties. That's what she's for. That's what she's good for. That's her important role in itself, but obviously not of the same status of the men. Okay, but no, this is about Athens. Okay, right, moving on. This video could be quite long. Oh, here we go. Pericles' funeral speech of 429. No, this is written by Thucydides. In fact, if we go to this, detailed knowledge with good interpretations of ancient sources and a good understanding of their limitations, a key factor of this is, if you were seeing this won't have been Pericles' actual speech, okay? It won't have been his speech. This is a big part of history in the ancient world, was almost the author's ability to recreate these speeches. Now, they might be true to the theme of the speech. They might even have some passages that were actually accurate to what they said, but a lot of it was basically a chance for the author, the historian, to say, look how good a writer I am, okay? And this is a limitation of this. So it might not be what Pericles actually said. It might be, there'll be debate about how accurate it is. But this is Thucydides' words, maybe based on Pericles' words, but maybe not that accurately, we can't say. So Thucydides was a historian from Athens, born around 460 and he died around 400 and he died around 400, okay? I should point out at this point is that, in fact, very soon we're going to start looking at Herodotus, and Herodotus is kind of called like the father of history, because he effectively wrote the first history. But his history was very different to Thucydides, who wrote very shortly after him. So in terms of the order of, like, chronological order of histories, it's like Herodotus comes up with this amazing thing, and Thucydides very shortly after writes his own thing. But Thucydides' style of history is quite, well, it's closer to our style than Herodotus is, and they're quite different in themselves. So yeah, Thucydides was an Athenian historian, and this comes from his account of the Peloponnesian War, and that's the war that took place between Athens and Sparta. And I swear it lasted about 27 years, but that was it. Yeah, because it actually... Right, okay, so this is what I can say. The Peloponnesian War goes from 431 to 404, but the Thucydides' account ends in 411. So this speech was apparently delivered in 429, and it's perhaps the most famous passage of the whole thing, and it's recording a speech of Pericles, who was Athens' most eminent politician. So Athens didn't have, for example, a prime minister or a president, and the way that the Athenian political system works wasn't really like this, and we can talk about this more in class. But they would have had people who spoke up more consistently, and therefore gained this reputation and become almost politicians in a modern sense. And it was, as it says here, it was an established practice by the late 5th century BC to hold a public funeral in honour of all of those who died in the war. Now, of course, 429, that's just after the start of the war, so lots of people will have been dying. Also, it comes to the point where Athens was, there was a plague. In fact, that's actually Thucydides died shortly after, not Thucydides, Pericles died shortly afterwards. So there was lots of death going on in Athens at this point in time. Anyway, so Pericles, as this eminent man, was chosen to give this speech. So just as it would have been important for him as a rhetorical exercise, it's known, as I mentioned before, an important rhetorical exercise for Thucydides. It's an opportunity for him to show, look how clever I am, look how well I can write. Okay, and this is, as I said, one of the limitations of the source, and the sort of thing that you need to consider when, if you were to use this source in a longer mark question, you need to say that, okay, it might show this, but we need to consider or keep in mind that these might perhaps not have been Pericles' actual words. Are these Pericles' views, or are these Thucydides' views? Okay. And there'll be debate about how close it is. But as it says here, Thucydides' version would at least have reflected the themes, but whether it quotes, we can't know. I've sent there's a link here which you might wish to click. It's a speech in full, it's very long. So yeah. So this is the extract that you have in your prescribed sources. Perhaps I should say a word or two on the duties of women to those of you who are now widowed. I can say all I have to say in a short word of advice. Your great glory is not to be inferior to what God has made you, and the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticising you. Okay, and this is the idea of the status of women in Athens. That's what this theme is, and it's very similar to what we just saw from Aristotle, who is talking about Sophocles, his quote here, and obviously Sophocles' quotes itself. All these three people are talking about the importance for women to not be talked about. We talked about how women in the past how women were effectively meant to be kept in their homes to do the housework, to do the weaving, to look after the slaves, whatever it is. Okay, their job is not to be out in the city making decisions. Their job is not to be fighting. Their job is to basically make sure that the men can do what their job is. Okay, and that's what. So we can talk about with this the status of women, that they're over such a status that you don't want to hear about them, and if they're not heard about, that's them doing their job. Now you might think that's wrong and sexist, and by today's standards, of course, it is. But the point is, this is a different time. Okay. And this is Athens. Make sure you know it's specific to Athens. Right, you've seen questions about Lysistrata before, and I've talked about how you might not know much about it yet, and that's fine. So Aristophanes was the writer of Lysistrata, okay? And he was a comic playwright. He might not have been born in Athens, but his plays would have been put on in Athens. Okay, his first play was performed in 427, and he wrote about 40 plays throughout his life, and is known as the father of comedy. I would recommend watching that video there. It's not that long, so click on the link if you wish after this, or pause it and do it now. So Old Comedy, of which Aristophanes is our source, uses fantastical scenarios to dissect contemporary political issues. So he basically he satirises political events and current events, but through a mad lens. Okay, so this is what Old Comedy is effectively. It's, let's try and think of a modern example. You might want very modern at the moment, the war that's going on in Israel and Palestine, and you might want to be, as a political satirical mind, coming up with some crazy war, like, I don't know, between foxes and rabbits, to try and comment on the war there. So this is kind of what he does, and you'll see how this Lysistrata is such a mad idea to talk about current events. So In this way, Lysistrata tells the story of women fed up with their husbands' warmongering. So I should point out that, as it says here, it was written in 411, okay, part during the Peloponnesian War, i.e. the war between Athens and Sparta, okay, and they go on a sex strike until their husbands make peace. And that's exactly, it's as simple as it sounds, okay. His outlandish scenario of commenting on the current affairs is to say, all right, okay, we're fed up of the war, and this might have been an opinion that quite a lot of people held. They just had a disaster. In fact, actually, I think you've just read the story about Socrates. Have we? Yeah, I think we just read a story about Socrates, in which he's put on trial and he argues that 8 people shouldn't have died at once, shouldn't have been put to death at once. It's the same disaster. But anyway, so Aristophanes himself wasn't particularly a fan of the war, and obviously lots of people wouldn't have been, but there was still, in this democracy, there's still enough people who would argue for this war with Sparta. Okay, so the play can be summarised thus. It was written not long after the catastrophic defeat of the Athenian expedition to Sicily. Now this is another... they made some bad decisions at the time. A pretty good argument against democracy, and as a result, just after this play was written, an oligarchy got put in place in Athens, the revolt of the 400, and as it says here, an oligarchy regime was ready to make peace and became in charge of the Athenian political system. Lysistrata depicts, I'm pretty sure this information just comes from Wikipedia, by the way, and I'm not ashamed to say that. Lysistrata depicts the seizure of the Acropolis, so this is the high city, the place where the Parthenon is. We went to see this last year, remember. And the treasury of Athens by the city's women, who, at Lysistrata's instigation, have, together with all the women of Greece, so they've actually come together with, including with Spartan women, because the idea of the play is that all the women are fed up of their husbands going to war and dying, because then what do they have? I mean, it might be different in Sparta, but in Athens, for example, we've talked about the state of women's lives once their husbands die. Also, you might think, women, we keep giving birth to children, and these children are going to war and then they're dying. That's not very nice for us. You won't want to lose your child. Anyway, so they're going on the sex strike till the men make peace. Obviously, there's comedy in this, in that men can't do anything without sex. The women defy their menfolk until the peace is arranged, after which both the Athenian and Spartan wives are reunited with their husband. So obviously, it's a farce, okay? It didn't happen. So don't use this as some sort of factual idea. It's humorous in a bawdy sense, I guess. It's indecent. Some videos here, themes, summary is of the plot, a big summary there. So here we go. We're going to look at the sources second, so should we look at the source now? No, we'll read this and then go back through the source. So the source highlights how and why women are kept quiet, not involving themselves in city politics, nor are they able to, with little urgency, at least outside the home, granted to them by their husband. Okay, the reason the source will be able to do this is because the idea of the play is that the women are doing all these things. Part of the humour comes from the fact that women can't do these things. These women are confined to their homes, they're confined to their weaving, they're confined to looking after the house. Okay, they're not in charge of politics, and if they were, perhaps the joke is that, and you often saw this again, think about the COVID-19 pandemic, in which the countries that were led by women perhaps did better than the ones that were led by men. Same sort of idea. Women have this empathy that men apparently don't possess. But there's the comedy in that the women are suddenly taking charge and perhaps making a better decision. To what extent do you think that? Oh, you probably need to read this. Knew perfectly well what the men were up to. Okay, so we've talked about how you see there's a source of the elsewhere in these sources, and we've talked about before about how close husband and wife actually were, and you might want to think about that with the question: to what extent do you think the women knew perfectly well what the men were up to? given how society was arranged, i.e. the men making decisions, going out, doing all this, and the women staying in their homes. And perhaps they might not be that close. Marriages were often a convenience, okay? So, and I've given you a reference to a page in Search of the Greeks for that. So then we talk about limitations of this source. So it's from a comedy, okay? It's not real life, in which it's intentionally creating these ridiculous situations, which I hope I've emphasised by now. So there's one element, okay? You might want to use this source for whatever question might come up, but you need to bear in mind that it's a comedy, okay? And it's kind of crazy at that. 2, you need to consider it's written by a man. How much can a man know what goes on in a woman's mind, okay? How much does a man, how much is he able to write about what women are going through? Because he doesn't experience that. He can see it. How empathetic is he to be able to understand this, okay? Do we have any women's written sources? Not many, okay? That's another limitation you might think with all of these things. How much basically can you learn about women when your written sources for it are men, okay? So yeah, how much can we learn from a source that's a comedy? Okay, certainly not. This is a really interesting source, and we'll look at it in a second. But it's not non-fiction, right? It's not like getting out a modern historical account or a newspaper. Well, even though they've got their own issues. So you can see how you need to consider these things. So we'll leave that last point until we've read through the thing. So Lysistrata. Previously, we used to put up with whatever you men did in silence, thanks to our self-control. You might want to bear in mind here how it's a women's glory to be quiet, okay? It's a glory because perhaps it suggests that they need to be in control of themselves to be able to do that. For you did not let us grumble, okay? Well, what does that say about the status of women? Is it actually suggesting, as we saw in the first source, that there's a power imbalance? Well, obviously there is. The status of man, woman, slave, okay? So bear that in mind. Even though we were displeased with you, but we knew perfectly well what you were up to, and as we mentioned before, how true might that be? And often indoors, bear in mind what we know about women, what you've read about previously, we would hear that you had made a bad decision on some important issue. Then, how would they know if it was a good or bad decision? Or in what sense is it a good or bad decision? Are they right? Or who's right here? I mean, if you're a peaceful sort like myself, or like the women are going to be in this, and perhaps Aristophanes is, perhaps a good decision is not going to war. But other people might say, well, we've got a perfectly good reason to go to war. All right? That's always with politics and whatever. A satire, there's always more than one side. You've got to keep these things in mind. But yeah, the point of the play is obviously that he doesn't like war, and he's suggesting that. But think as well about how amazing it is that Athens allowed these opinions to be so publicly shared and thought about, and creates that thought in other people. Then, though distressed within, we would laugh and ask you, what have you decided at the assembly to write on the stone about the peace treaty? What's that got to do with you? Keep quiet, my husband would say, and I kept quiet. Okay, so here we've got the idea of maybe women can think. Oh my goodness, women can think. Well, why are they allowed in the assembly? It's a different point. But he's saying, well, maybe women are thinking, but they're not saying anything about it because the husband would shut them down, and this is your status again. What's it got to do with you? Keep quiet. And you see how men are keeping women placed down in society. So another woman said, I would never have kept quiet. Well, think about, is that true? Okay, you don't get any examples really of women storming places and being like, oh, we want to take over power. Magistrate, who would be a man, you'd have regretted it if you hadn't kept quiet. Okay, so this is the idea of men forcing women down. And also again, the man being above the woman. Lysistrata, that's why I, for one, kept quiet at that time. Okay? So think about this glory of women, of being quiet, and how silence is good for them, and good for society. might not agree with it. Obviously, it's not a good thing, but it's a different society. Bear in mind, this is Athens as well, not Sparta. Not that. Anyway, we'll move on from that. After this, we would find out about some even worse decision of yours. Then we would ask, husband, how is it that you are acting so stupidly? And he would scowl at me and say that if I didn't get on with my spinning and he would give me a good clout on the head. War will be the responsibility of men. So here you can see women and men's roles in society. You've got the women kept in the house, that's their status. You do your spinning, you do your weaving, you look after the household. Okay, men, our job is to make decisions concerning the city, it's to go to war. Okay, so we've talked about, you can see here the status of men, the status of women in Athens. Okay, obviously you've got to bear in mind the limitations of this source. It's not factual, but obviously for it to be funny it has to have some sort of relevance to real life. This source, Aristotle Politics and Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, and also Sophocles' Ajax 293. Okay, so these are the three that are referenced and then the link to Sophocles, are all talking about the mutiny of women, okay, in Athens. And who were largely confined to their home. So you've got the status of women. These women are quiet, they are kept in their home, they're kept in their place. Men are in charge of Athenian society. Okay, now we're moving on to the second part of the women topic in our course, and that is marriage. And again, obviously we've talked about this before, the idea of marriage in Athens, how you might not agree with it, and how it also differs in Sparta, which we'll look at later, or you already know about, but you might want to think about later. And now again, it seems pretty gross today, but it's a different society. First thing to point out here is this passage comes from Demosthenes. Now Demosthenes, again, lived in the 4th century BC, so kind of after Athens' great period. But it did become democratic again, and in this time, and Demosthenes was very pro-democracy, and he was very anti-Macedon, who was increasingly powerful in the Greek world at that time. And he was a politician, he was an orator. He spoke a lot. He's very well known for his speaking ability. He was people like Cicero, Roman orator, looked up to him. So like this, okay. But being a politician wasn't particularly a job. But as you can see here, he'd write speeches as well, and this is what this is. We'll talk about this a bit more. So his speeches provide valuable information on the political, social and economic life of 4th century Athens. Okay, this is a more general thing about Demosthenes. You might want to, if we go right up to the top again, detailed knowledge with good interpretations of the ancient sources and good understanding of their limitations. One thing to point out then about him is when we talk about Demosthenes, is he can be a good source for political, social and economic life. As I said, he was pro-democracy and he defended it. So then, against Neaira, I don't actually know how to say that. Neaira? Yeah, we'll go with Neaira. Was a prosecution speech delivered by Apollodorus of Arcanae against the freed woman Neaira. Okay, so this is a point. Why is it's been delivered by Apollodorus? Is it said Demosthenes here? Okay, and the reason for this is, unlike modern courts, or unlike Roman courts, if you went to trial in Athens, you had to defend yourself, okay? That means you would speak on your own behalf. You wouldn't have a lawyer to do it for you. But some people might think, oh, I'm not particularly capable of crafting a well-written speech, and this is where people like Demosthenes come in, or who's another famous example? Oh, what's he called? I'm pretty sure he comes up elsewhere in this thing. Lysias, I believe. And these people would effectively write their speeches for you. They get money for this. So it says Demosthenes, but it was delivered by this person because Demosthenes would have written it. It was preserved as part of the Demosthenic corpus, though perhaps this wasn't actually written by Demosthenes. The fact that it comes up as Demosthenes in your prescribed sources, however, suggests that perhaps you should consider this as written by Demosthenes, not pseudo-Demosthenic. Okay, but maybe you might want to bring out that limitation. But it probably would be not particularly relevant to whatever question you're answering. The speech was part of the prosecution. A hetaira, now remember we've talked about, so a hetaira was basically a type of prostitute. Maybe look through your notes for a more detailed difference between them and other sorts of prostitutes. And she was accused of unlawfully marrying an Athenian citizen. Though the speech claims that the case was brought for personal reasons, the date of the prosecution has led scholars to believe it was in fact politically motivated. And we don't know the outcome. Okay? So this will definitely be perhaps a limitation of the speech, because I said perhaps and then definitely, because it will depend on what the question is. Okay? And we talked about marriages before, what's needed for it to happen, and the importance of marriages in preserving the legitimacy of an Athenian male's line, because of the way wealth worked compared to Sparta, for example. The speech is important as the best extant biography of a woman from the classical period of ancient Greece, the most extensive surviving source on prostitution in ancient Greece, and the source of Athenian laws on adultery and citizenship, which do not otherwise survive. So here, remember, we're in the marriage, Athenian marriage section. So when you're talking about the importance of a source and its limitations, perhaps it might be a good point to say that this source is really important, because it is particularly the whole speech rather than just the source, it's the best example of giving us information. Obviously it's not perfect, and obviously this is going to be biased one way compared to another, but it's something to keep in mind. However, we don't know the exact nature of, however you say her name's relationship with Stephanos. It's what it was like, okay? It's clear that they've been in some form of relationship for about 30 years, and that the prosecution, i.e. Apollodorus, claimed that she claimed to be married to him. The position of the defence seems to have been that she was living as a concubine. Okay, so this might be perhaps an example of a source that suggests that whereas we thought about Athenian marriage in a very black and white sense, perhaps there's no love involved, perhaps this is an example of, although legally these two couldn't marry because of the different statuses, perhaps this is actually an example of, I'm just postulating here, but perhaps this is a more nuanced idea of relationships in Athens and marriage, that perhaps these people actually did like each other in a proper sense, but they couldn't be properly married, but they were effectively married in the sense that they lived together, they cohabited, they loved each other, even though it wasn't technically possible. So basically the case is that she illegitimately claimed rights of Athenian citizenship, and we talked about why that's important, and claimed it was his wife, even though it was illegal for non-Athenians to marry Athenian citizens. These are some quotes from Search of the Greeks about, in Search of the Greeks, the book you've read, about the importance of citizenship. So this basically shows, this source, as we're going to look at it, shows how marriage is a pragmatic arrangement for the purpose of begetting children without the necessity for love. Indeed, for the sake of more personal relationships, the Athenian man sought to other female companions. And this is where my point was coming in, that perhaps Stephanos' relationship with Neaira, or however you say her name, was actually more personable. They might actually have liked each other, whereas Athenian marriage might not be particularly like that. It's a social contract, effectively. Limitations of this source, before we look at it, it might have been politically motivated, and this political motivation is that Apollodorus, the guy who's speaking, was opposed to Stephanos, and they had been this way for many years. Also, we don't know the relationship between Stephanos and Neaira, and we don't know the result, and it's written by a man. And in fact, all of these written sources in here, you can basically say as a limitation, it's written by a man. Right, so let's actually look at the source. This is matrimony, a wedding. When a man begets children and presents his son to his phratry. Now this is and deem, so these are basically like political groups within Athens, kind of on a different scale, in the same way that your council is part of the country or something like that, and gives his daughters as being his own in marriage to their husbands. Hetairai we keep for pleasure, concubines for daily attendance upon our person, but wives for the procreation of legitimate children and to be the faithful guardians of our households. So as well as marriage here, you could talk about how this talks about status of women in Athens, about their job basically to bring up children and to look after the house. Okay, we've talked about how this passage perhaps suggests that Neaira, she may have been effectively a prostitute, or she might have been someone who Stephanus actually liked quite a lot, which isn't necessarily what marriage in Athens was about, because marriage in Athens was basically a social thing, or this is what we've talked about, in which you keep a legitimate bloodline and you bring forward children, and the women look after the house and the men do whatever the men do. Okay, so this source is basically talking about how marriage is this sort of contract, and you can pick out bits about the importance of women being wives for the sake of bringing forth children and looking after the house. Okay, the next one is Hesiod, Works and Days. Now Hesiod is an Athenian. He was an epic poet. He was a bit like Homer, but he's not as famous, probably slightly after Homer, although the timeline's blurry. And it's not his only work, and it's about peasant life. It's addressed to his brother, who has secured an excessive share of inheritance and seeks to gain another advantage in a similar manner. The work tries to dissuade him from this. The passage does seem to back up what we've learnt already about the age of men and women, who would aim to marry about 30, and women would be about 13 to 15. So when we look at this passage about the age of wives, bear in mind this is a piece of work that was probably written about 200 plus years before the sort of time we tend to look at. Also highlights women's condition on entering into marriage, and how sadly women were perceived as a man's property. So again, maybe you want to think about this as the status of women, man, woman, slave, and there are other relationships we can talk about, other texts that relate to this. Xenophon, which we do look at twice and is also in your book. This source from a past paper is an example of what a bad wife might look at. I'll just let you read that. If you want to pause the video, you can. But I'm not going to go through it now because we actually look at this, although probably slightly set. No, I think we look at this in the whole speech at some point anyway. But yeah, the Athenian, the limitations of this source, if you had it in an exam, it's old. Like I said, it's several hundred years before the period we're talking about. Again, it's written by a man, as you can see a lot, and he wasn't an Athenian. So if you talk about Athenian marriage, this guy's not an Athenian, and he was written a long time before. But here we go. The right age to take a wife to your home is not much short of 30 years and not much more, i.e. the men are about 30 when they get married. That is the right age of marriage. The wife should be 4 years past puberty and marry in the 5th. So this kind of backs up the idea of girls, and I say girls and I mean girls, about 13 to 15 year olds marrying men of about 30 years old. Marry a maiden so that you can teach her reliable habits. And what do you think about what these habits might mean? Well, these habits might mean stuff like weaving. They might mean stuff like looking after the house, looking after the money in the house, so how much money you need to spend on buying food for the next period of time, etc. The best thing is to marry a girl who lives near you. Look all around you, lest by marrying you become a laughingstock to the neighbours. And it's about this next sentence will point it out. For a man has no better possession than a good wife, and none more dreadful than a bad one, who is just waiting for the next meal. She scorches him, however vigorous he may be, without the need of a torch, and hurries him to a cruel old age. Okay, so this source again can be used in two senses. The status of women in Athens, i.e. they're a man's property. It's not nice, is it, by modern standards? And I'm sure by their standards as well. And also by Athenian marriage, so we're talking about ages, being 30, a man being about 30, the girl being about 13 to 15. Okay, there are several points. If you saw it, you could easily pick out, or if you memorised it. Okay, moving on. Right, okay, this is our first non-written source, and this is a Pyxis, which is basically like a vessel for putting liquid in, and this is showing a wedding procession. Follow the link to see more information about it, and I think there's an image in the book that you've seen about it. So it's pottery, that's the first thing to point out. It's showing a marriage procession. So in fact there's been a very similar question to this either on a spec paper or a past paper, is that what does this vase, let's be more general, show? Well, it's showing a marriage procession, and we've talked about an Athenian marriage. You've got the horses, that's probably the wife here. You've got the wedding torches. This is the part basically where they're getting taken from her home to her new home, the home of her husband. As it says here, the bride is driven in the chariot from her parents' home to that of her husband. The procession symbolises the bride's transfer from one oikos, her family's, to another, her husband's. You can see the bride and groom in the chariot, accompanied by a man carrying a torch, which is meant to ward off evil spirits. So this is what I just pointed out. This is your wife and husband, and that's the man carrying a torch. Note how the bride is dressed. Like nowadays, she was adorned in an expensive and fancy manner, wear a robe, crown, jewellery and nice hair, all of which can be seen in the image. So you might get more factual recall questions. We've talked about marriage before. Similarity. You might even have a longer question saying similarities and differences of a marriage in ancient Athens compared to a marriage in modern day. And you might say, well, in the same ways that we get dressed up and do our hair and wear jewellery, all that happens, but obviously there's lots of other differences, and you can see these things in this vase. The Pyxis, so this is the shape of the vessel from a classical world, usually cylindrical box with a separate lid, mostly used by women to hold cosmetics, trinkets or jewellery. Yeah. Perhaps interesting, therefore, that this object likely belonging to a woman is decorated with a marriage scene. You might want to think about that. Is this because, well, is this something that would have been created that a woman would want to get for herself, for example? So the sort of ideas that she might want to get for herself, sort of thing she likes, or is it the sort of thing that a man might think she might want? For example, think about what a man buy for his wife these days, but perhaps has. I'm not going to give an example, but I can think of one very specifically in my head. With the difference between what a woman actually wants and what a man might want, or is it generally something that she might have wanted? A reminder of maybe she lives in a happy marriage, or as we talked about previously when we talked about marriage more generally, how it actually might be a pretty terrible day for her. So yeah, this object probably belonged to a woman, and that's something to bear in mind. Limitations: we don't know who owned it, we don't know who decorated. Was it bought for a woman or at a woman's choosing, which we talked about? What did they use it for? What elements does the painting miss out? How stylised is such an image? So if you were to see this in your exam paper, or you wanted to reference it, we'll talk about how we do that later. This video is going to be very long. You might want to think about all these things about limitations when we talk about source analysis, okay? Obviously, you get the phrase, a picture fails 1,000 words. And there's lots of information you can get from this, but also there's lots of information that's missing. Okay, and that's basically the summary of what you'd want to say in your exam question. The fourth source, again on Athenian women, and this is well, no, it's not Socrates, but it's written in his voice from Xenophon Oikonomikos. This is where we get the word economics from. So we'll talk about Xenophon first. Xenophon was born in Attica, which is basically the region around Athens, in around 430 and died just before 350. So there's your timeline. He was a general, historian and philosopher. The Anabasis, his most famous work, records the return of the mercenary army from Persia. And that's actually a really interesting bit of Greek. A bit like Aristotle above, sorry. He wrote about lots of stuff as well. And his works will likely have been written during the last 20 years of his life. So again, this probably was written beyond what's the word I'm looking for? The peak of Athenian power. Which is why some people would like to go to war, because there's money in war. And the oikonomikos, which means household management, hence where we get economics from, is a Socratic dialogue. Right, so this is what this means is basically you have two people. You frame a debate around two people having views, and they discuss their views. In reality, it might be that the writer has a certain view, or wants to encourage you towards a certain view, or wants you to think about how these two opposing views and come up with your own view. Okay, so it's a Socratic dialogue in which Socrates discusses agriculture and household management. Leadership is often the real subject. The most famous section, of which we have an excerpt here, is an account of how the rich Isomachus trains his ingenious, innocent and unsuspected young wife for an important role in the running of their home. Again, remember, we're in the marriage in Athens section. Isomachus was an Athenian gentleman father. In the discussion related by Socrates, Isomachus describes the methods he used to educate his wife in housekeeping, their practices in ruling and training slaves, and the technology involved in farming. Whereas Hesiod talks about teaching a wife reliable habits, this source highlights the sort of things that Athenian things would have learned in her home before getting married, so that she was already well skilled enough to perform the duties of a wife. And again, you read about this, and we've talked about this previously. What the sort of a woman wouldn't just get married to 13 or to 15 and then suddenly be expected to learn how to weave, how to look after a house, all this stuff. She would already have had, obviously her skills would develop over time, and especially if she had her own power, at her own, doing it on her own accord, but she would have skills before that, and obviously they develop, but she's not learning from scratch when she gets married, which is a bit contrasting to what Hesiod said above. So yeah, this source highlights how you pick a girl who's perhaps already skilled enough to do these duties. Isomachus, however, seems to agree that with the early sources about women being quiet, so we talked about this in Status, basically all the things about Status, Aristotle, Thucydides / Pericles' funeral speech, Sophocles' Ajax, which we only really saw temporarily, and what was the other one? What have I said? Oh, and Lysistrata. I think, was that the one? Yeah, I think so. Seems to agree with the importance of a woman being quiet and backs up the information we have about the importance of weaving and spinning and self-control and child rearing, these things that an Athenian wife was expected to do. Also suggests that pragmatism in the arrangement of marriages, this social contract, which we talked about being quite black and white, how true it is, probably quite true, but might be scope for some love. Perhaps love develops, who knows. And after great consideration about who would be the best partner of our house and children, husband and family chose one another, with children being a significant factor of this, with love not perhaps being a factor, and that perhaps she didn't have a say. An interesting part of this passage is their common property. Is that indicative of a woman's lack of ownership or suggestion of more equality between the couple? Remember, she was in charge of the finances. Well, she was in charge of the house, and there might be elements of control of finances in that. Again, there's reference to the book you've got. And this source is, I'm not going to go through it now because it's in this booklet. So here we go. She's certainly given the ability to make decisions, but all within the confines of a home. So this is a woman's point, power or lack of. We talked about how women didn't have this political power, which is only Lysistrata, especially, and everything else. So she can make the decisions, but it's within the home. The woman's job is within the home. The man's job is outside of the home. And as it says here, compared with Lysistrata. So the limitations of this, before we go through it, it's a fictional dialogue. We don't know whether Isomachus should be seen as Xenophon's mouthpiece, i.e. Whether Isomachus is what Xenophon believes, or as a target of satire. Because it's a dialogue, okay? There's two people speaking. Do we know whether he means this person or this person? Indeed, there was a real Isomachus whose family became the subject of ridicule in Athenian political oratory. After Isomachus dies, his widow moved in with her daughter, and her son-in-law thence became pregnant by him, which caused the daughter to commit suicide. I'm just going to say pause this and read this rather than me reading it out for you. I think this is again from Wikipedia. Okay, so let's go through the source. Socrates asks a new husband, so Socrates is the other part of this Socratic dialogue, which makes sense in this, I guess, about his wife. Ah, I said, Isomachus, that is just what I should particularly like to learn from you. Did you yourself educate your wife to be all that a wife should be? Or was she already well skilled enough to perform the duties of a wife when you received her from her father and mother? Okay, so this is what we've talked about before, about a girl's education in Athens compared to perhaps in Sparta, which we'll talk about elsewhere and we've read about before. Does a girl married as a husband already knowing these skills, the weaving, how to look after a household, not how to bring up children, because obviously she won't have had children yet, but there are other elements of this, the cleaning, looking after slaves, etc. Or are these things, like Hesiod says, that the husband can teach to her when they get married? And this is why perhaps the time difference between Hesiod and this and other factors come in. Well skilled, he replied, i.e. she's been taught well by her family how to do these things. What could she have known when I married her? She was not quite 15 at the time, and had been most carefully brought up to see and hear as little as possible and to ask the fewest questions. Again, you've got the status of women, or the lack of. Now it's a glory, apparently, to be quiet. Do you not think one should be satisfied if at marriage her whole experience consists of knowing how to take wool and make a dress, and seeing how her mother's handmaidens had their daily spinning tasks assigned to them? In regards to control of appetite and self-indulgence, she have received the soundest education, and I think that is the most important matter when bringing up a man or woman. Okay, so we've got about what a girl might learn prior to a marriage, i.e. learning some skills to do with weaving, for example. Then all else, I said, you taught your wife yourself, Isomachus, until you had made her capable of attending carefully to her duties, not until I had offered sacrifice and prayed that I might teach, and she might learn all that would lead to the happiness of us both. Okay, it's quite an interesting point here, the happiness of us both. Whose view is this? Okay, how accurate is this? How happy will she actually be? And did your wife join in the sacrifice and prayer to that effect? Most certainly, with many a vow to heaven to become all she ought to be. Her whole manner showed that she would not neglect what was taught to her. So the importance of the skills an Athenian woman would have, and obviously note the importance of religion in all this. But it's unlikely to be anything to do with the sort of questions you'll have to answer. Tell me, Isomachus, I beg you, what you decided to teach her first. To hear that story would please me more than any description you could give me of the most splendid gymnastic contest or horse race. Why, Socrates, when she becomes suitably domesticated? So I've highlighted this because it's indicative of women's status, okay? Domesticated, to do with the home. What's a woman's job? To be in the home. This is a marriage, okay? We're in the marriage section here. You're talking about her status with a marriage within the point of a home, okay? That is, she was termed enough to take part in a discussion. I asked her this: have you ever considered, dear wife, what led me to choose you as my wife out of all women, and your parents to entrust you to me of all men? Note about what this shows marriage to be like. This is not, oh, they met and fell in love and got married. This is, he chose her, her parents chose him. She's not got a whole lot of say in this. This is what we're talking about marriage in Athens. She's not got a whole lot of say in this. It's an arranged marriage. It's not necessarily a forced marriage, which is different, but it's an arranged marriage. It was certainly not because neither of us could find someone else to share our bed. Okay? That's another point you could highlight. If you were hearing this, would you feel happy? Perhaps he's about to explain himself in a way that might make you feel that way. But yeah, it's not like he's almost suggesting here. Well, it's not. I'm not going to explain my thoughts fully here, but I'm sure you know where I'm going. That I'm sure you know. No, it was after great consideration, I for myself and your parents for you, about who would be the best partner for house and children, that I chose you, and your children's to be the best, to the best of their ability, chose me. Okay, so this is an importance of marriage in Athens, not of love or anything like that. It's the importance of marriage in Athens, of legitimacy of children, of looking after the household, of basically of containing the wealth, of keeping the citizenry pure. Okay, that's what marriage is. It's a kind of cold contract, effectively. If at some future time God grants us children, we will take counsel together how best to bring them up. For that too will be a common interest and a common blessing if they live to fight our battles, and we finding them support and aid when we are old. Another part of marriage, perhaps not talked about previously, is how there's no care homes. It's the job of the children to look after them. I mean, we've thought about this perhaps slightly in the points where the woman's gone from her family's house to her husband's house, and the husband's mother has been there to talk to them. But at present there is our house here, which belongs to both of us. It is common property, for all that I possess goes into the common fund, in the same way all that you had was placed by you into the common fund. Now, is this a point where they're actually, like, if you were to share a bank account with your significant other, or is it more of a, I'm the man, I'm actually in control of all this? Think about that. What the limitations of this source. Remember, keep in mind that it's not non-fiction. You don't know if it's satire or if it's real opinion. You don't quite know what it's trying to get at. We need not stop to calculate in figures which of us contributed the most, but rather let us understand that whichever of us proves the better partner, he or she at once contributes what is most worth having. I'm pretty sure that this text comes up as another source later on, and I think at this point in the text he's talking about how she's a good wife. I think later on he talks about how she's perhaps not a good wife. But I'm going to stop the video here. I'm just going to scroll down a second so you can keep in mind the limitations. Again, and how you may or may not wish to use this with relevance to the question. It is worth pointing out that your answers need to be relevant to the question, and when we do I'm going to stop the video here because I want a break. I've been speaking for so long. When we do a video on basically exam style, an important part of it is making sure it's relevant, and obviously the limitations have to be relevant to the question as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here because I don't know how long it is, but I bet it's really, really long. We're about halfway through the women, so the next video will have women's household duties in Athens and the Spartan part. And then we'll probably make a third video, unless if the next bit's a lot shorter, relating to past questions and guidance for these questions. Okay, I hope this is useful. I hope by stopping it, maybe it's too long, at least you can spread out your learning. I should have said at the start, so bear this in mind for the next one. Maybe write these sort of things down, or write any things you like about what I say, or any ideas that you have on your sheet, which looks like this, as we go along, or make notes in a book, whatever you want to do. I'm going to stop the video, as I said. We'll move on to the next bit in the next video. I hope this has been useful. Yeah, thanks.